The Vorthax Empire had conquered 17,000 star systems across 3 galactic arms. Their dominion stretched from the crystalline nebulae of the outer reaches to the dense star clusters near the galactic core. For 12,000 cycles, they had been the undisputed masters of known space, absorbing lesser species into their collective through a combination of overwhelming military force and calculated terror. High Admiral Keth Voren stood on the observation deck of the Eternal Dominion, flagship of the 7th Conquest Fleet, and stared at the pale blue marble floating in the void before him. His scales, a deep purple that marked his noble bloodline, rippled with anticipation as he studied the sensor data streaming across his neural implant. "Such a small world," he murmured, his vertical pupils narrowing. "And yet, the readings are unusual." Fleet Intelligence Officer Emrethka slithered forward, her serpentine form coiling as she brought up a holographic display. "The planet is designated Sol 3 by the locals, though they call it Earth. Our long-range probes have been monitoring their electromagnetic emissions for approximately 40 of their years." "And your assessment?" Mrethka's secondary eyelids flickered, a sign of uncertainty that Keth Voren noted with displeasure. "The species is primitive by our standards, High Admiral. They've only recently achieved interplanetary capability within their own system. Their fastest vessels would take generations to reach even the nearest star. They possess nuclear weapons, but no directed energy technology. Their military forces are fractured among hundreds of competing nation-states." "Then this should be a standard pacification operation," Keth Voren said, though something in Mrethka's posture suggested otherwise. "Speak freely, Intelligence Officer. What concerns you?" Mrethka brought up a new display, and the hologram shifted to show detailed analysis of Earth's environment. "High Admiral, our classification protocols place this world in a category we rarely encounter. It is what the Galactic Survey designates as a Class 4 Deathworld." Keth Voren's scales darkened. "Explain." "The planet's environmental hazards exceed 93% of colonized worlds in our database. Surface gravity is 9.8 meters per second squared, higher than optimal for most sentient species. The atmosphere contains a highly reactive gas that constitutes 21% of the air mixture. This gas, they call it oxygen, is corrosive to most known biological materials and serves as an accelerant for combustion." "They breathe poison," Keth Voren observed. "Interesting." "That is only the beginning, High Admiral. The planet experiences extreme temperature fluctuations, ranging from -90 to +50 degrees on their Celsius scale. Violent atmospheric phenomena, hurricanes, tornadoes, lightning storms are common occurrences. The planet's crust is unstable, producing earthquakes and volcanic eruptions. The oceans contain millions of species, many of them predatory. The land is home to venomous insects, large carnivores, and microscopic organisms that can kill in hours." The hologram shifted again, showing images captured by their surveillance drones. Keth Voren watched as a human vessel cut through storm-tossed seas, its crew struggling against waves that could crush a Vorthax like an insect. He saw humans climbing mountains where the air itself was too thin to sustain life, their bodies encased in protective gear as they pushed toward the summit. He watched footage of their wars, brutal, relentless conflicts fought with chemical explosives and ballistic weapons that would have horrified any civilized species. "They fight each other constantly," Mrethka continued. Our records show continuous warfare throughout their documented history. They have developed weapons capable of destroying their entire civilization multiple times over, and they have come close to using them on more than one occasion. Their biology is remarkable. They can lose significant portions of blood volume and survive. They can sustain traumatic injuries that would kill any Vorthax and continue fighting. Their immune systems adapt to pathogens in ways we've never observed. They consume the flesh of other animals as a primary food source. They domesticated apex predators for companionship. Keth Voren studied the images with growing unease. One showed a human female running a distance of 42 kilometers without stopping. Another showed a human male lifting metallic weights that exceeded twice his body mass. A third showed their athletes performing physical feats that defied what he knew of biology. "And their psychology?" he asked. "Aggressive, territorial, and pack-bonded. They form strong emotional attachments to each other, to their social groups, and even to inanimate objects and other species. When threatened, they demonstrate a phenomenon we've termed defensive rage. Historical records show that when their social bonds are threatened, they become capable of extreme violence and sacrifice. They also exhibit a unique trait we've been unable to fully analyze. They call it spite. Even when faced with certain defeat, they will expend resources to harm their enemies rather than surrender." Keth Voren was silent for a long moment. In his centuries of service to the Empire, he had conquered dozens of worlds and subjugated hundreds of species. The process was always the same: arrive with overwhelming force, demonstrate the futility of resistance through targeted destruction, and accept the inevitable surrender. Most species valued their own survival above all else. They could be reasoned with, negotiated with, broken. But these humans... "Your recommendation, intelligence officer?" Mrethka's scales paled. Standard protocols suggest orbital bombardment to reduce their population to manageable levels before ground occupation. However, given the planet's classification and the species' apparent psychology, I would recommend against conquest entirely. The cost-benefit analysis is not your concern, Keth Voren interrupted. The Eternal Throne has decreed that humanity will join the Empire. Their world sits at a strategic junction between the Orion Arm and the Perseus Transit. Their resources are valuable. Their planet, despite its hazards, is habitable. And their species... He paused, studying the images once more. Their species will make excellent shock troops once properly conditioned. Mrethka bowed her head in submission. "As you command, High Admiral." Keth Voren turned back to the viewport, watching Earth turn slowly beneath them. "Begin standard intimidation protocols. Disable their satellite network and primary military installations. Let them see what they face before we offer terms." The first strike came without warning. Dr. Sarah Chen was at her desk at MIT when the power failed. Not just in her building, everywhere. Through her window, she watched the lights of Boston wink out in a wave, darkness spreading across the city like a tide. Emergency generators kicked in moments later, bathing her lab in red light, but the computers remained dead. Her phone was dark. The servers that held 20 years of her life's work, gone. She would later learn that it happened everywhere, simultaneously. Every satellite, every power grid, every computer system on Earth went silent in the same instant. A single pulse of energy, broadcast from somewhere beyond the moon, had reduced humanity's technological infrastructure to scrap metal and melted circuits. Then the ships came. They descended from the clouds like ancient gods of war, massive vessels that defied physics, their hulls gleaming with alien alloys that reflected the sunlight in colors humanity had no names for. They hovered above every major city on Earth, casting shadows that stretched for miles. And from each ship, a message broadcast on every possible frequency, in every human language, with perfect pronunciation and syntax. People of Earth, you have been chosen to join the Vorthax Empire. Resistance is not merely futile, it is biologically inadvisable. Your species has been judged worthy of incorporation. You will serve the eternal throne, and in service you will find purpose. Your leaders will present themselves at the coordinates we provide within one planetary rotation. Failure to comply will result in the sterilization of your population centers. The message repeated on an endless loop. Sarah watched it all unfold through the window of her lab, her brilliant mind racing through possibilities, even as her heart pounded with primal fear. She was a physicist, a specialist in theoretical propulsion systems, and everything she was seeing violated the laws she had spent her life studying. These ships were impossible. Their technology was centuries, perhaps millennia beyond anything humanity could achieve. And yet, she found herself studying the ships with a clinical eye, noting the placement of what appeared to be weapon arrays, the patterns of energy emission, the way they maintained position against Earth's gravity. They were advanced, yes, but they were machines. Machines could be understood, and anything that could be understood could be beaten. Her phone buzzed, somehow still functional despite the EMP. She looked at the message and felt her stomach drop. Dr. Chen, your presence is required immediately. Black Site transport en route. Authorization, Prometheus. Sarah took one last look at the alien ships, her jaw setting with determination. Then she grabbed her jacket and headed for the door. They gathered them in a bunker beneath the Rocky Mountains, the greatest minds humanity had to offer. Physicists, engineers, biologists, military strategists, linguists. 200 people who had spent their lives pushing the boundaries of human knowledge, now faced with a problem that made everything they had ever accomplished seem insignificant. General Marcus Reeves stood at the front of the room, his weathered face betraying none of the fear that Sarah knew he must be feeling. He was a veteran of 3 wars, a man who had sent soldiers to die and carried their names with him. Now he faced an enemy unlike anything humanity had ever encountered. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice steady. "As of 6 hours ago, we are under attack. The enemy has demonstrated technological capabilities that exceed our own by a factor we cannot accurately measure. They have eliminated our satellite network, disabled our power infrastructure, and positioned their vessels in a manner that suggests they can strike any point on Earth with impunity. They have issued an ultimatum demanding our surrender." He paused, looking around the room. "I'm not going to insult your intelligence by telling you we have a plan. We don't. That's why you're here. What I am going to tell you is this: surrender is not an option. Not because we're too proud or too stupid to accept defeat, but because every piece of intelligence we've gathered suggests that incorporation into this Vorthax Empire means the end of everything we are. They don't want allies, they want slaves." A murmur ran through the assembled scientists. Sarah found herself nodding slowly. "So, here's what we know," Reeves continued. "Our observatories tracked their fleet's approach. They came from a point approximately 8 light-years distant, Alpha Centauri, we believe. Their method of faster-than-light travel appears to manipulate the fabric of space-time itself, creating what our theoretical physicists are calling a warp bubble. They number approximately 200 vessels, ranging in size from 300 meters to the flagship, which exceeds 5 kilometers in length. He brought up a holographic display, one of the few systems that had been shielded from the EMP. Sarah leaned forward, studying the alien vessels. Their weapons are primarily directed energy, lasers, particle beams, and something we're tentatively calling graviton projectors. Their ships are protected by some form of energy barrier that our conventional weapons cannot penetrate. A coordinated nuclear strike by 3 nuclear powers, conducted 4 hours ago without civilian leadership approval, was completely ineffective. The weapons were destroyed before they reached their targets. "Then what exactly do you expect us to do?" Dr. James Harrison asked. He was a Nobel laureate, the world's foremost expert on electromagnetic phenomena, and he looked like he hadn't slept in days. "You're describing an enemy against which we have no viable weapons, no defense, and no means of escape. The math doesn't work, General. We lose." "With respect, Dr. Harrison," Reeves replied, "the math always said we lose. Every war humanity has ever fought, someone did the math and said we lose. Every disease, every natural disaster, every extinction-level event, the math said we lose. And yet, here we are, 8 billion of us, the most successful invasive species this planet has ever produced." He turned to face the window, looking out at the mountain above them. "I've spent my life studying human warfare, ladies and gentlemen, and if there's one thing I've learned, it's this: humans don't surrender. Oh, we might pretend to, we might play dead, bide our time, wait for our moment, but we don't give up. It's not in our nature. We're the descendants of survivors, every single one of us. Our ancestors looked at this death world and decided that they were going to live here anyway. They domesticated the wolves that would have eaten them. They built shelters against the cold that would have frozen them. They developed agriculture against the famines that would have starved them. And when other humans came to take what was theirs, they fought back. They always fought back." He turned back to the room. "So I'm not asking you to tell me how to win. I'm asking you to tell me how to survive long enough to make winning possible. Because if there's one thing I know about humanity, it's that given enough time, we will figure out how to kill these bastards. We always do." Sarah felt something shift inside her, a spark of defiance that she hadn't expected to feel. She raised her hand. "Dr. Chen?" Reeves acknowledged. "They're ships," she said, standing. "You said they use some form of warp technology. That means they're manipulating gravity, space-time curvature. The energy requirements for something like that." She trailed off, her mind racing. "General, can you get me detailed sensor readings from their approach? Specifically, any gravitational anomalies, radiation signatures, anything that might tell us how their drives function?" Reeves nodded slowly. "We have limited data, but yes. What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking that any system that manipulates gravity has to have some form of control mechanism, and any control mechanism can be disrupted." She smiled grimly. "I'm also thinking that if we can understand how they move, we might be able to understand how to stop them from moving. A ship that can't maneuver is just a very large target." Around the room, other scientists began to stir. Dr. Harrison raised his hand. "If we're looking at energy-based weapons and shields, there might be frequency vulnerabilities we can exploit. No barrier is perfect. There has to be a wavelength, an amplitude, something that penetrates." Dr. Yuki Tanaka, a biologist from Tokyo, spoke up. "If we can capture specimens, living or dead, we can analyze their biology. Every organism has weaknesses. They may be advanced, but they're still biological entities subject to the same fundamental rules we are." Within minutes, the room was buzzing with ideas, plans, desperate hopes that might amount to nothing. But the despair was gone, replaced by something harder, sharper. These were not ordinary people. They were the best and brightest that humanity had to offer, and they had just been given the most important puzzle of their lives. General Reeves watched them work, a grim smile playing at the corners of his mouth. He had seen this before, the moment when human beings stopped being victims and started being survivors. It was the moment he had been waiting for. He pulled out his phone and dialed a number that shouldn't exist. "This is Prometheus," he said. "We're going to need the resistance networks activated, all of them. Tell them to go dark and wait for instructions." Then he looked back at the scientists, his smile fading to cold determination. "And tell them to start stockpiling everything that explodes." Part 2. The Occupation. The first Vorthax ground forces landed 72 hours after the ultimatum expired. They came in armored transports that screamed through the atmosphere, deploying thousands of soldiers in precise formations around the major population centers. The soldiers themselves were terrifying. 7-foot reptilian creatures encased in powered armor, carrying weapons that could vaporize a human at 300 meters. They expected surrender. They found something else entirely. In Beijing, the initial occupation force was ambushed before it could establish a perimeter. Human fighters emerged from the subway tunnels, armed with improvised explosives and captured weapons, and tore into the Vorthax column with suicidal ferocity. They died by the hundreds, but they took aliens with them, far more than the Vorthax commanders had anticipated. In Moscow, sleeper cells that had been dormant since the Cold War activated simultaneously, launching coordinated attacks on the alien command structure. One cell managed to detonate a dirty bomb within a Vorthax forward operating base, rendering an entire city block uninhabitable and forcing the invaders to divert resources to decontamination. In São Paulo, the local gangs put aside decades of blood feuds and united against the common enemy. They knew the favelas better than any map could show, and they turned every narrow street into a killing ground. The Vorthax learned quickly that urban warfare against humans was a nightmare beyond anything in their tactical manuals. High Admiral Kethvorin received the reports with growing disbelief. His forces had conquered worlds with billions of inhabitants and encountered nothing like this. Other species, when faced with the inevitability of defeat, sought terms. They bargained for their survival, for the preservation of their culture, for the safety of their young. They were rational. Humans were not rational. "They're using chemical accelerants," one of his commanders reported, his voice strained. "Primitive petroleum-based incendiaries. They strap them to their bodies and run into our formations. The explosions barely scratch our armor, but the psychological effect on the troops? "I don't want to hear about psychological effects," Kethvorin snarled. "I want to hear about pacification progress." "High Admiral, with respect, there is no progress. Every population center we attempt to control becomes a battlefield. They've weaponized their entire infrastructure, their transit systems, their water supplies, their communications networks. We've intercepted transmissions suggesting coordinated resistance across multiple continents. They're calling it the underground." Kethvorin's scales rippled with fury. "Then we will give them a lesson in consequences. Target their historical monuments, their cultural centers, their places of worship. Show them that everything they value will be destroyed if they continue to resist." The orders went out. The Parthenon was reduced to rubble. The Forbidden City burned. Notre Dame, rebuilt after its first fire only decades before, was vaporized in a flash of coherent light. The Great Pyramid of Giza, which had stood for 5,000 years, became a crater of molten glass. The Vorthax expected grief, despair, surrender. Instead, they got rage. The attacks intensified. Human fighters began targeting Vorthax soldiers in their sleep quarters, using weapons that bypassed their armor. Poisons, gas attacks, improvised biological agents. One particularly audacious cell managed to infiltrate a Vorthax command ship and detonate a nuclear device in the reactor chamber, vaporizing the vessel and killing everyone aboard. Kethvoran stared at the wreckage on his display, his mind struggling to comprehend what he was seeing. A nuclear weapon. These primitives had brought a nuclear weapon onto one of his ships. How? How had they penetrated his security? How had they been willing to die just to destroy a single vessel? High Admiral, Intelligence Officer Mrethka said quietly, "I believe we have miscalculated." Explain. These creatures, they do not value their own survival above all else. They value something else, something we don't have a word for. It appears to be related to their social bonding behavior. When we threaten what they love, they do not become compliant. They become more dangerous. That's not possible. Every species prioritizes survival. It's fundamental to biology. Yes, High Admiral. For most species it is. But humans. She brought up a historical record showing images from their past. Humans regularly sacrifice their lives for abstract concepts. They die for ideas, for freedom, for honor, for revenge. They die to protect strangers they have never met. They die for symbols. They're doing it now. Every human who straps explosives to their body and charges our lines is dying not for survival, but for something they value more than survival. Kethvoran was silent for a long moment. In all his years of service, he had never encountered anything like this. What do we do? I don't know, High Admiral. Our standard pacification protocols assume a species that can be reasoned with, that can be intimidated into submission. Humans cannot be intimidated. The more we push, the harder they push back. It's as if their species evolved specifically to resist conquest. That's ridiculous. Is it? Mrithka brought up a new display showing Earth's evolutionary history. This world has been trying to kill them for millions of years. Everything on this planet, the weather, the predators, the diseases, even the planet itself, has been a constant threat to their survival. They evolved in an environment where giving up meant death. Their entire psychology is built around the principle that you fight no matter what, because fighting is the only way to survive. She paused, her scales pale with something that might have been fear. We thought we were conquering a primitive species, High Admiral. We were wrong. We picked a fight with the most dangerous predators their Deathworld ever produced. And now we're trapped on their territory, surrounded by 8 billion of them, each one willing to die to take us with them. Kethvoran stared at the display, watching another report of a Vorthax patrol wiped out by human fighters. His mind raced through options, calculating possibilities, searching for a path to victory. He found nothing. "Increase orbital bombardment," he ordered finally. "Sterilize the remaining population centers. If we cannot control them, we will eliminate them." The orders went out. The first target was Tokyo, a city of 37 million humans, the largest concentration of their species on the planet. The bombardment ships moved into position, their weapons charging, their crews preparing to reduce the city to ash. They never got the chance. Part 3. The Counterattack. Dr. Sarah Chen hadn't slept in 9 days. She stood in the underground laboratory, surrounded by screens and equipment that had been assembled from whatever could be salvaged after the EMP. Her eyes were bloodshot, her hands trembling from caffeine overdose and sheer exhaustion, but her mind was clearer than it had ever been. "It's graviton manipulation," she said, pointing at the equations on the screen. "Their warp drives, their shields, their weapons, it's all based on the same fundamental principle. They figured out how to generate and control gravitons at a scale we didn't think was possible." General Reeves stood beside her, flanked by the surviving members of the Prometheus team. "Can we replicate it?" "Not a chance. We're decades, maybe centuries away from that level of technology." She smiled, a tired, desperate smile that had nothing to do with humor. "But we don't need to replicate it. We just need to disrupt it." She brought up a new display, showing a pattern of energy readings. Every graviton generator needs a control mechanism, something that modulates the field, keeps it stable. Without that control mechanism, the field collapses. And when a graviton field collapses, she made an explosion gesture with her hands. The results are catastrophic. How do we disrupt it? That's the tricky part. Their systems are incredibly robust. Multiple redundancies, shielding, encryption. A direct attack on the control mechanism isn't feasible. But there's a back door. Graviton fields interact with electromagnetic radiation at very specific frequencies. If we can generate a signal at exactly the right wavelength, at exactly the right amplitude, we can induce resonance in their control systems. It would be like hitting the resonant frequency of a wine glass, except instead of the glass shattering, their entire graviton matrix would destabilize. Reeves nodded slowly. "What do you need?" "A broadcasting array capable of generating terawatts of power at a wavelength of precisely 4.7 nanometers. The signal would need to be sustained for at least 30 seconds to induce full resonance. And we'd need to get within range of their fleet. Their ship's own graviton fields would interfere with the signal at longer distances." "Define range." "Less than 500 kilometers. Reeves let out a low whistle. "That's suicide range." "Yes," Sarah agreed. "It is." There was silence in the room. Everyone understood what she was saying. Someone would have to fly a broadcasting ship directly into the Vorthax fleet, hold position for 30 seconds while every weapon in that fleet tried to destroy them, and somehow survive long enough to complete the broadcast. They wouldn't survive. It was impossible. "I'll do it," said a voice from the back of the room. Everyone turned. A woman stepped forward, young, athletic, with close-cropped hair and the bearing of a soldier. Sarah recognized her as Captain Elena Rodriguez, one of the few military pilots who had survived the initial strikes. "Captain Rodriguez," Reeves began. "With respect, General, there's no one else. My squadron is gone. My family was in Madrid when they hit the cultural centers. I've got nothing left to lose and everything to fight for." Her voice was steady, her eyes hard. "Give me the ship and I'll fly it into the heart of their fleet. I'll hold position for however long it takes." "It's a one-way trip," Sarah said quietly. "I know." Rodriguez smiled. The same tired, desperate smile Sarah had worn moments before. "But if it works, it'll be worth it. And if it doesn't, well, at least I'll take some of them with me." Reeves looked at her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "You'll have volunteers. No one's going alone on this one." "No," Rodriguez shook her head. "One pilot, minimal crew. Every additional person is additional weight, additional life support, additional variables. This needs to be clean and fast." "She's right," Sarah said. "The smaller the ship, the harder it will be to track.
We can rig a stealth shuttle with the broadcasting equipment. It won't be invisible, but it might buy us a few extra seconds."
"And where do we get terawatts of power?" Reeves asked. Sarah pointed at the mountain above them. "There's a decommissioned nuclear reactor about 200 miles north. It was taken offline after the EMP, but the core is still active. If we can rig a direct tap system—" She trailed off, calculating. "It's not elegant, but it would work. The shuttle would need to carry its own power source, though. A reactor that size would be too heavy." "Then we use something smaller," Dr. Harrison interjected. He had been silent until now, but his mind had clearly been working. "A focused nuclear detonation. We don't need sustained power. We need a single burst of massive energy. If we configure the broadcasting array to store energy from a nuclear explosion and release it as a coherent signal—"
"That's insane," Sarah said. "Is it less insane than anything else we've done in the last 2 weeks?"
Sarah opened her mouth to argue, then closed it. He was right. Everything about this plan was insane, but insane was all they had. "How long to build it?" Reeves asked.
"If we work around the clock, repurpose everything we have, maybe 72 hours.
Reeves nodded. "Then we'd better get started. Tokyo is scheduled for bombardment in 48 hours. If we can't stop that, nothing else matters." The team scattered, each member racing to their assigned task. Sarah grabbed Rodriguez's arm as she passed.
"Captain, Elena, are you sure about this?"
Rodriguez looked at her, and for a moment, the hardness in her eyes softened. "I've been fighting since I was 18, Doctor. Every battle, every mission, I knew it might be my last. But this?" She gestured at the screens showing the alien fleet, the occupied cities, the death tolls climbing by the hour. "This is different. This is everything. Every person I've ever loved, every dream I've ever had, every song I've ever heard. It all ends if we lose. So yes, I'm sure. I've never been more sure of anything in my life." She pulled away and walked toward the hangar. Sarah watched her go, feeling a mixture of awe and grief that she couldn't quite articulate. 48 hours. That was all the time they had to save the world. She turned back to her equations and got to work. Part 4. The Battle of Earth. The shuttle was ugly. There was no other word for it. Cobbled together from the remains of 3 different aircraft, reinforced with salvaged armor plating, and bristling with improvised antennas and broadcasting equipment, it looked less like a spacecraft and more like something that had crawled out of a scrapyard. But it worked. Dr. Chen had tested the systems a dozen times, and every simulation showed the same result. If they could get close enough, if they could hold position long enough, the graviton disruption signal would propagate through the entire Vorthax fleet. Captain Rodriguez climbed into the cockpit, strapping herself in with practiced efficiency. The interior was cramped, every available space filled with equipment that hummed with barely contained energy. The nuclear device that would power the broadcast sat in a shielded compartment behind her seat, its yield carefully calculated to produce the exact burst of electromagnetic radiation they needed. "Communications check," General Reeves's voice came through her earpiece. "Reading you loud and clear, General. Telemetry is good. We're tracking you. Remember, you have one shot at this. The Vorthax will respond the instant they detect your approach. You need to reach broadcast position before their weapons can lock on." Understood. Rodriguez took a deep breath, looking out through the cockpit window at the night sky above the mountain. Somewhere up there, the alien fleet waited. 200 ships, each one capable of destroying a city in seconds. Any words of encouragement? There was a pause. Then Reeves' voice came back, rough with emotion. "Give 'em hell, Captain. And if you see God up there, tell him Earth isn't finished yet." Rodriguez laughed,
A genuine laugh, the first she'd felt in weeks. "Will do, General. Rodriguez out." She powered up the engines, feeling the shuttle vibrate around her. The stealth systems engaged, bending light and absorbing radar in ways that the Vorthax would hopefully never expect from such a primitive species. She lifted off, climbing through the atmosphere, the stars growing brighter around her.
Below, a world held its breath. High Admiral Kethvorin watched the bombardment preparations with grim satisfaction. Tokyo would burn, and with it, the heart of human resistance. Once the humans saw that their largest cities could be obliterated at will, they would finally understand the futility of their struggle. "Bombardment ships in position," his tactical officer reported. "Weapons charged, awaiting your order. Begin." The first salvo was just starting to descend when the alarm sounded. "Contact!" the tactical officer shouted. "Unknown vessel approaching the fleet. Origin unknown. Trajectory, it's coming straight at us." Kethvorin spun toward the display. A single point of light was racing toward the fleet, moving faster than anything human should be capable of. "Identify." "It's too small for accurate analysis. Configuration doesn't match any known human vessel. It's..." The officer's voice cut off as the readings came in. "High Admiral, it's broadcasting some kind of electromagnetic signal. Wavelength 4.7 nanometers. The amplitude is..." The officer never finished his sentence. The graviton disruption signal hit the fleet like a wave of pure chaos. Every ship in the Armada shuddered as their control systems went haywire, as the carefully modulated graviton fields that protected them and powered them began to destabilize. Shields flickered and died. Engines sputtered and failed. Weapons that had been aimed at Tokyo swung wildly off target. And on the Eternal Dominion, High Admiral Kethvorin watched in horror as his flagship began to tear itself apart. The graviton field that held the ship together, that kept its massive hull from collapsing under its own weight, was oscillating out of control. Metal groaned and screamed. Bulkheads buckled. Power conduits exploded in showers of sparks. Crew members were thrown across compartments as the artificial gravity fluctuated wildly. "What is happening?" Kethvorin demanded, gripping his command throne as the deck lurched beneath him. "Our graviton matrix is destabilizing," an engineer screamed. "The control systems can't compensate. We're losing containment." Through the viewport, Kethvorin could see the rest of his fleet suffering the same fate. Ships were breaking apart, their hulls crumpling like paper as the forces that held them together failed. Explosions blossomed in the darkness, reactor breaches, fuel ignitions, munitions cooking off. In the space of 30 seconds, the most powerful military force in the galaxy had been reduced to a field of tumbling wreckage. "This is impossible," he whispered. "They're primitives. They can't." The viewport shattered as a piece of debris struck the Eternal Dominion's hull. The explosive decompression sucked Kethvorin into the void before he could even scream. Captain Elena Rodriguez watched the Vorthax fleet die around her. She had done it. The broadcast had worked exactly as Dr. Chen had predicted. The nuclear device had detonated, powering a burst of electromagnetic radiation so precise that it had found the exact frequency needed to destabilize the aliens' graviton systems. The invincible fleet was falling apart before her eyes. But her shuttle was dying too. The blast from the nuclear device had fried most of her systems. The hull was breached in 3 places, and only her pressure suit was keeping her alive. The engines had failed, and she was drifting through a field of debris, watching as the last of the Vorthax ships succumbed to their wounds. "General Reeves,"
she said into her calm, not knowing if anyone was listening. "General, the fleet is destroyed. I repeat, the Vorthax fleet is destroyed. Earth is safe."
Static answered her. The communications array was damaged beyond repair. She was alone, floating in the darkness between worlds, watching the wreckage of an empire burn around her.
She should have been afraid. She should have been angry that she was dying, that she would never see Earth again, that she would never know what happened next. But all she felt was a profound sense of peace.
She had done her job. She had saved her world. 8 billion people, mothers and fathers, children and grandparents, artists and scientists, and ordinary people just trying to live their lives, would wake up tomorrow because of what she had done.
It was enough. It was more than enough.
"Hey, Mom," she whispered, looking out at the stars. "Hey, Dad, I hope you can see this. I hope you're proud." She closed her eyes, letting the darkness take her.
And in the vast silence of space, a human being died with a smile on her face. Part 5. The Reckoning.
The Vorthax Eternal Throne learned of the disaster within hours. Faster than light communication networks carried the news across the Empire. The 7th Conquest Fleet, the mightiest armada ever assembled, had been destroyed by a species that couldn't even travel between stars.
The initial response was disbelief. The reports must be wrong, corrupted, falsified by enemy agents. No primitive species could defeat a fleet that size. It was simply not possible. But as more information came in, sensor logs recovered from the wreckage, final transmissions from dying ships, analysis of the weapon that had destroyed them, disbelief gave way to something far more dangerous. Fear. The Eternal Council convened in emergency session, their holographic forms gathering in the great chamber that had witnessed 12,000 years of imperial triumph. They stared at the data with undisguised horror. "This weapon," the first counselor said, his voice barely above a whisper. "This graviton disruptor. It targets the fundamental technology of our civilization. Our ships, our infrastructure, our very cities. All of it depends on graviton manipulation. If the humans can produce this weapon—"
"They cannot," another counselor insisted. "The report is clear. They used a nuclear device to power the signal. It was a one-time weapon, a desperate gambit. They do not have the capability to mass-produce it."
"Not yet," the first counselor replied. "But they will. You've read the intelligence assessments. These humans, they learn. They adapt. A generation ago, they had no capability for powered flight. Now they've destroyed a fleet that could conquer 100 worlds. Give them time, and they will find ways to mass-produce this weapon. They will find ways to reach beyond their own star system. They will find ways to come for us." Silence fell over the chamber.
"What do you suggest?" someone asked finally.
"We have 2 options. First, total extermination. We assemble every remaining fleet in the Empire and reduce their planet to slag. Leave nothing alive, nothing that could ever threaten us again."
"And the second option?" The first counselor's scales rippled with something that might have been embarrassment. "We sue for peace."
The outcry was immediate and vociferous. Peace? With primitives? With a species that had just destroyed the greatest fleet in the Empire? It was unthinkable. It was an insult to every value the Vorthax held dear. But the first counselor raised his hand for silence. "Listen to me. These humans, they are not like other species. They evolved on a death world,
They have been fighting for survival since before they were sapient. Every challenge we throw at them only makes them stronger. Every weapon we use against them, they learn to counter. Every tactic we employ, they adapt to. He brought up a holographic display, showing the history of human warfare. Images flashed across the chamber. Ancient armies clashing with swords, medieval siege engines, the first primitive firearms, the trenches of the world wars, the nuclear standoff of the Cold War. They have been at war with each other for their entire history, the first counselor continued. They have developed weapons capable of destroying their own civilization multiple times over. They have survived plagues that killed half their population. They have survived ice ages that froze their continents. They have survived asteroid impacts that wiped out the dominant species of their world. And they have survived us. He paused, letting his words sink in. We can destroy their planet. We probably should. But here is what I want you to consider. Even if we succeed, even if we reduce Earth to a dead rock, some of them will survive. Some always do. They will scatter to the stars aboard whatever vessels they can build. They will hide in the asteroid belts and the outer systems. They will remember what we did to their world. And they will spend however long it takes, generations, centuries, millennia, learning to kill us. The chamber was silent. We cannot afford that enemy, the first counselor said. We cannot afford a species that carries that kind of hatred, that kind of determination, that kind of evolutionary heritage. Better to make peace now, while they are still contained to their own system, while we still have something to offer them. What could we possibly offer them? Technology, knowledge, the secrets of faster-than-light travel, of graviton manipulation, of all the wonders our civilization has achieved. We give them what they want most, the stars, and in exchange, they agree to leave us in peace. And if they refuse? The first counselor's scales darkened. Then we have no choice. We destroy them, no matter the cost. But we must try diplomacy first. Because if we give them a reason to hate us, if we give them a cause to unite against us, we will have created the most dangerous enemy this galaxy has ever seen. The debate continued for hours, but in the end, the council reached the only conclusion they could. Emissaries were dispatched to the Sol system, carrying offers of peace and technology. The mightiest empire in the galaxy was suing for peace with a species that couldn't even leave its own star system. The humans accepted the offer. Not because they had to, not because they were afraid, but because, in the end, they were pragmatists. They had survived the first challenge, but they knew that the galaxy held more dangers than they could imagine. Better to gain allies, to acquire technology, to build their strength for whatever came next. And so, humanity took its first steps onto the galactic stage, not as conquerors, not as subjects, but as equals. Part 6. The Memorial. 1 year after the Battle of Earth, Dr. Sarah Chen stood in a plaza in Geneva, surrounded by dignitaries from 100 nations and representatives from a dozen alien species. Before her stood a monument, a simple pillar of white marble, inscribed with the names of those who had died in the war. At the very top, in letters of gold, was a single name: Captain Elena Rodriguez. Sarah reached out and touched the stone, feeling the smoothness of the marble under her fingertips. Around her, the ceremony continued, speeches and honors and promises of eternal remembrance. But she wasn't listening. She was thinking about the woman who had saved the world. They had recovered her body from the debris field 3 weeks after the battle.
The shuttle had been destroyed, its hull torn open by the nuclear blast that had powered humanity's salvation. But Elena's pressure suit had kept her intact, preserved in the cold void of space, her face still wearing that final, peaceful smile. Sarah had been there when they brought her home. She had watched as the coffin was carried through streets lined with millions of mourners, as Elena Rodriguez was laid to rest in the cemetery at Arlington alongside the greatest heroes in American history. She had spoken at the funeral, struggling to find words that could capture what Elena had done, what her sacrifice had meant. She still didn't have the right words. Maybe there were none. "You look like you're somewhere else," a voice said behind her. Sarah turned to find General Reeves standing there, his uniform immaculate, his face bearing new lines that hadn't been there a year ago. The war had aged all of them, but Reeves bore it more heavily than most. He had sent Elena to her death. He had given the order that had saved the world. He would carry both with him for the rest of his life. "I was thinking about her," Sarah admitted, "about what she said before she left, about how this was everything, every person she'd ever loved, every dream she'd ever had, every song she'd ever heard. It all ends if we lose." She was right. "I know. That's what I keep thinking about. We came so close to losing everything. And she just got into that shuttle and flew into a fleet that could have destroyed our entire civilization. She didn't hesitate. She didn't ask for time to think about it. She just did it." Reeves was silent for a moment. "When I was young, I had a commanding officer who told me something I've never forgotten. He said that heroism isn't the absence of fear. It's the decision that something else is more important than fear. Most people never have to make that decision. They go through their whole lives never facing a moment where everything depends on what they do next." He looked at the monument, at Elena's name etched in gold. But some people do. Some people are called to stand at the threshold and decide whether they're going to step through. And the ones who do, the ones who choose to sacrifice themselves for something greater, they're not crazy and they're not trying to be heroes. They're just people who understand something fundamental about what it means to be human. "And what's that?" Reeves smiled, a sad, knowing smile. "That we're not just individuals. We're part of something bigger, something that started before we were born and will continue after we're gone. When Elena flew into that fleet, she wasn't just dying for herself. She was dying for every human who had ever lived, every human who would ever live. She was dying for the idea of humanity itself." He paused, his eyes glistening. "And that's the thing the Vorthax never understood. That's why they lost. They thought they were fighting a collection of individuals who would prioritize their own survival. They were wrong. They were fighting a species that was willing to die, individually, by the millions, to ensure that the whole survived." Sarah nodded slowly, understanding. It was the same principle that had driven evolution on Earth for billions of years. The individual organism might die, but the species continued. The body might perish, but the gene survived. It was written into the very fabric of life on their Deathworld, carved into their DNA by millions of years of struggle and selection. The Vorthax had come to conquer a primitive species. They had found something far more dangerous, a species that had learned, over millennia of evolution, that survival was a collective endeavor. A species that would fight to the last individual because they understood that the individual was never really the point. "The Vorthax ambassador asked me a question yesterday," Reeves said. "He wanted to know why we hadn't asked for more during the negotiations. We could have demanded reparations, territory, technology that would have made us the dominant power in the sector. We could have brought them to their knees." "What did you tell him?" "I told him that we didn't want to dominate anyone. We just wanted to survive." He looked up at the sky, where alien ships now orbited peacefully alongside human satellites. He didn't understand. His species has been conquerors for so long that they've forgotten what it's like to just exist, to live and let live.
They might learn, Sarah said, given time.
Maybe. Or maybe they'll try again. The Empire is wounded, but it's not dead. There are factions that want revenge, that see us as an existential threat. And honestly, they're not wrong. We are a threat. Every species that evolved on a Deathworld is a threat, because we carry the seeds of survival in our genes. We're the cockroaches of the galaxy, almost impossible to kill, capable of living anywhere, and absolutely relentless when we set our minds to something. He laughed softly. The Vorthax didn't just lose the battle, they lost the future. Because now humanity knows the galaxy is out there. Now we know there are threats beyond our little blue marble. And knowing us, knowing what we've done throughout our history, we're going to spend the next few centuries making sure those threats can never hurt us again.
Is that a good thing?
I don't know. I hope so. I hope we've learned something from this, from the war, from the destruction, from the sacrifice. I hope we can become something better than we were. But even if we don't, he shrugged. At least we're still here. At least we get a chance to try.
Sarah turned back to the monument, running her fingers over Elena's name one last time. The woman who had saved the world. The woman who had understood what it meant to be human, not just in words, but in action. The woman who had flown into hell with a smile on her face, because she knew with absolute certainty that some things were worth dying for.
"Thank you, Elena," Sarah whispered, "for everything."
Around her, the ceremony was winding down. Dignitaries were shaking hands, aliens were exchanging polite phrases, the media was capturing every moment for posterity. But Sarah stayed where she was, her hand on the stone, her eyes closed. And in the silence of her own heart, she made a promise. A promise to live a life worthy of the sacrifice that had saved her. A promise to never forget what it meant to be human, the good and the bad, the beautiful and the terrible, the capacity for destruction and the capacity for transcendence. A promise to be worthy of the Deathworld that had shaped her species, and the heroes who had given everything to protect it. Part 7. The Legacy. 50 years after the Battle of Earth, the galaxy had changed beyond recognition. Humanity had taken the technology offered by the Vorthax and run with it just as the first counselor had predicted. Where other species would have spent centuries understanding and refining the principles of graviton manipulation, humans had built working prototypes within months. Where other species would have carefully tested their new vessels in controlled environments, humans had launched them into the unknown with reckless enthusiasm. The first human ship to break the light barrier was named the Elena Rodriguez, in honor of the woman who had made it possible. It launched from a space station in Earth orbit, carrying a crew of 50 volunteers who knew they might never return. It returned 3 months later, carrying samples from a planet in the Alpha Centauri system and data that rewrote entire fields of science. By the time 50 years had passed, humanity had colonized a dozen star systems, established trade relationships with 100 species, and built a fleet that rivaled anything the old Vorthax Empire could have fielded. They had also done something that the galaxy had never seen before. They had created an alliance. The human coalition was unlike any interstellar government that had existed before. It was not an empire, not a conquest, not a dominion of the strong over the weak. It was a voluntary association of species who had chosen to align themselves with humanity because they believed in what humanity represented. And what humanity represented to the rest of the galaxy was hope. The Vorthax had ruled through fear,
through the promise of destruction for anyone who opposed them. Humanity offered something different. They offered protection to species who had been preyed upon. They offered technology to species who had been exploited. They offered friendship to species who had been alone. They also, when necessary, offered war. Because humanity had not forgotten what they were. They were survivors. They were fighters. They were the children of a death world that had been trying to kill them since the dawn of their existence. And while they had learned to live in peace with those who wished peace, they had also learned that peace sometimes required the willingness to fight. The Battle of Proxima Centauri came 20 years after the Battle of Earth, when a remnant faction of the Vorthax Empire launched a surprise attack on the first human colony outside the Sol system. The colony was home to 5 million people, men, women, and children, who had come to build a new life among the stars. The Vorthax expected an easy victory. The colony's defenses were minimal. Their fleet outnumbered 10 to 1. They expected the humans to flee, or to surrender, or to die quietly. They were wrong. The colonists of Proxima Centauri did not flee. They did not surrender. They dug in and fought with everything they had, buying time for reinforcements to arrive. When the main human fleet came, 100 ships crewed by warriors who remembered what the Vorthax had done to Earth, the battle lasted less than 2 hours. The Vorthax fleet was annihilated. Every ship destroyed, every crew killed, every trace of their presence erased from the system. The message was clear: humanity protected its own. Anyone who threatened them would be destroyed without mercy. It was a lesson the galaxy never forgot. Dr. Sarah Chen lived to see all of it. She was 93 years old when she finally passed, surrounded by children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren who had grown up in a galaxy transformed by her work. Her graviton disruptor, refined and perfected over decades, had become the foundation of human military technology. Her equations were studied in schools on 100 worlds. Her name was spoken with reverence by physicists who would never meet her. But the achievement she was proudest of was simpler than any of that. On her desk, until the day she died, there was a photograph. It showed 2 women standing in front of a stealth shuttle, their arms around each other, their faces alight with exhaustion and hope. One was Sarah herself, decades younger, her hair still dark and her eyes still bright. The other was Elena Rodriguez, captured in the last moment before she flew to her death. Beneath the photograph, Elena had written a note. "See you on the other side, Doc. Don't keep me waiting." Sarah had kept the photograph for 50 years. She had looked at it every morning, letting it remind her of why she did what she did. She had told stories about Elena to anyone who would listen, her grandchildren, her students, random strangers on the street. She had kept Elena's memory alive, not as a distant hero, but as a real person who had laughed and cried and loved and feared, just like everyone else. On the day Sarah died, her granddaughter found the photograph lying on her chest, clutched in her hands. The old woman's eyes were closed, her face peaceful, her lips curved in a faint smile. She was buried with the photograph. Her epitaph, carved into the stone above her grave, read simply, "Dr. Sarah Chen. She helped humanity reach the stars. Now she rests among them." Epilogue: The Deathworld's Children. 500 years after the Battle of Earth, the galaxy was a different place entirely. The human coalition had grown to encompass over 1,000 species, spanning 10 galactic arms, and comprising trillions of sentient beings. It was the largest voluntary alliance in recorded history, built on principles of mutual defense, free trade, and individual liberty. At its heart, still, were the humans. They were no longer confined to a single blue marble orbiting an unremarkable yellow star. They lived on worlds of ice and worlds of fire, in habitats orbiting gas giants, in stations buried deep within asteroids. They had adapted their bodies to environments that would have killed their ancestors, modifying their genetics with technologies they had learned and invented and stolen from 100 different species. But they had not forgotten where they came from. Every human child, no matter where they were born, learned the story of Earth. They learned about the deadly world that had shaped their ancestors, the predators and diseases, the earthquakes and hurricanes, the constant struggle for survival that had forged the human spirit. They learned about the heroes who had defended that world when the Vorthax came. They learned about Elena Rodriguez and Sarah Chen and General Marcus Reeves and the millions of others who had fought and died so that humanity could survive. And they learned the lesson that their ancestors had paid for in blood. The galaxy is vast and dangerous, filled with wonders and terrors beyond imagination. There will always be those who seek to conquer, to dominate, to destroy. There will always be challenges that seem impossible, enemies that seem invincible, odds that seem insurmountable. But humanity had faced all of that before. On a little blue world at the edge of the Milky Way. They had faced a planet that wanted them dead, and they had survived. They had faced an empire that wanted them enslaved, and they had triumphed. They had faced the universe itself, and they had refused to die. Because that was what it meant to be the children of a death world. Not that they couldn't be killed, they could, and many had been. Not that they didn't fear, they did, as much as any species. Not that they were inherently special, chosen by some cosmic force to rule the stars. No, what made them different was simpler than that. It was the lesson they had learned through millions of years of evolution, the truth that was written in their very genes. Never give up. Never surrender. Never stop fighting. Never accept that defeat is inevitable, no matter what the odds say, no matter what the math predicts, no matter what anyone tells you. Because you are the heir to survivors. Every one of your ancestors, stretching back to the first self-replicating molecule in Earth's primordial seas, found a way to live when everything wanted them dead. That legacy lives in you. It lives in every human who has ever existed, and every human who ever will. You are the children of Earth, the children of a death world, and the universe itself cannot stand against you. In a plaza on Earth, still the spiritual heart of human civilization, even after 5 centuries, there stood a monument. It was ancient now. Its white marble weathered by time, its golden letters faded but still legible. Around it stood statues of the heroes who had saved humanity, Elena Rodriguez with her pilot's helmet under her arm, Sarah Chen with her equations carved into the pedestal, Marcus Reeves with his hand raised in eternal salute. Every year, on the anniversary of the Battle of Earth, pilgrims came from across the galaxy to stand before the monument. Humans and aliens alike, they came to remember what had happened and to honor those who had made everything possible. And sometimes, late at night when the plaza was empty, visitors reported seeing something strange. They said they saw figures walking among the statues, shadows that might have been ghosts or might have been tricks of the light. They heard whispers on the wind, fragments of conversation in languages both ancient and new. Some said it was the spirits of the dead, come to see what their sacrifice had wrought. Some said it was nothing at all. But those who had heard the stories, who knew what the humans had done and what they had become, believed something different. They believed that the whispers were not ghosts at all, but echoes. Echoes of every human who had ever lived, every struggle ever fought, every victory ever won.
They believed that in that plaza, under the stars that humanity had conquered, you could hear the heartbeat of a Deathworld's children.
And if you listened closely enough, you could hear them laughing. The end.